Thanks, Eric. I'll try to live up to that introduction.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming out today in a very inclement, but the beginning of our usual miserable winter here in Chicago. I've had a great sort of pleasure in rediscovering an important story, I think, in the history of not only Chicago, but also really the history of American socialism and radicalism that disappeared from public memory. I try to give an explanation of why I think that happened towards the end of my book. I don't know if it's a complete answer, but I think it's an attempt at an answer for that. But I think the Hickman story, really the story of James and Annie Hickman and their attempt to find a measure of dignity and freedom in Chicago that was missing from their lives in Mississippi, like millions of African Americans who came to the North, and then found something that was partly better and partly the same, and in some ways even more dangerous than what they were living in Mississippi. And their story really, I think, could have disappeared completely from any knowledge, except for any public knowledge, except for two events. The first event was James Hickman, who took, in an act of either revenge or despair or justice, or all three of them, shot and killed the landlord that he thought was responsible for the arson murder of his 4 youngest children. And James Hickman could have, that got some news and some publicity in Chicago, as you can imagine, in 1947. But that story itself could have just disappeared from memory. He could have just simply either been executed or disappeared for decades into the Illinois prison system. And it didn't because really of the political intervention of the Socialist Workers' Party, particularly led by their extremely talented and dynamic organizer, Mike Bartell, who organized a pretty unique political defense campaign that ultimately won James Hickman's freedom. How that was done and why something like this could take place in what was one of the most racially segregated, corrupt, violent, and in some ways extremely backward cities of the United States, which of course we're no longer like that anymore, are we? Is something to be said about the other history of Chicago, which is also a city of radicalism, a city of a working class militancy, a city that which had always had a section of its population that was prepared to take on the political establishment. That's the other Chicago. So I think what I'll do is I'll try to start out by talking a little bit about who James and Annie Hickman were and what brought them to America's second city. Like a whole generation of African Americans who began leaving the South beginning around 1900 and then with much more greater numbers and around World War I and really uninterrupted until about 1960 or 65, we saw the greatest internal migration really in American history and possibly even in world history. We're used to thinking of migration of millions of people leaving Europe over a period of 50 or 60 years, coming to the United States, and that's seen as the Great Migration, when in fact there was an equally important migration of millions of African Americans from all parts of the South and the border states to the northern U.S. and to the western U.S. To leave, the horrible conditions of Jim Crow America, for obvious reasons of one, economic despair and inequality, but also just searching for political freedom that seemed to be impossible to get. And the mixture of those two produced this incredible migration of people. And then the consequences of that migration of decades afterwards, of the Black Power movement, the anti-war movement, a revival of the union movement in the 1960s and 70s, can all be attributed really to go back to the great migration of African Americans to the North and to the West. And James and Annie Hickman were two people who were part of this great migration. They were born in the Deep South in Mississippi. And when you say Mississippi, I think immediately you think of the worst states of the old Confederacy, a state notorious for not only its state-sponsored violence against African Americans, but a long history of vigilante violence, lynchings, and a prison system which was described by one author as revenge on African Americans for the Civil War, really a kind of hell on earth. African Americans were very much, many lived in a state of near slavery, working as sharecroppers, a system that sort of portrayed itself as, you know, a system of equality, you know, the farmer or the plantation owner. You know, if we like people, they're farmers. If we hate them, they're plantation owners. Jimmy Carter was a farmer, not a plantation owner, right? I'll provide the seed and we'll divide the crops up. And it had this appearance of equality, but in fact, you know, sharecropping was a game that sharecroppers could never win. Long days, you're always ripped off for the work that you did. It was something you tried to flee from. James and Annie Hickman were the sons and daughters of sharecroppers. They worked as sharecroppers. They had a family of 9 children. And beginning in the 1930s, it became pretty clear to the Hickman family that there was just simply no future for their family, themselves or their family as a whole in Mississippi. And James Hickman in particular looked to his 4 youngest children and looked at the circumstances of Mississippi and decided that particularly for his 4 youngest kids, that he really had to get out if they were going to have any type of future life. And like many African Americans who came to the North, he came up during World War II, during the great boom in the economy, which drew, you know, hundreds of thousands of African American men in particular. Remember, it's the men who go first and then they bring the family later, who got industrial jobs in a whole range of basic industry, steel, auto, you know, all sorts of manufacturing for the war effort. James Hickman came up here in 1945, got a job at Wisconsin Steel, which used to be a mammoth facility on the far south side of Chicago, which became one of the bigger, more well-known battles over plant closings in this town in the 1980s. But at that time was one of the major steel makers in the United States. It had only recently been hiring black workers. It was basically the pressure brought by A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement that forced Roosevelt to issue an executive order that, of non-discrimination in the war plants. Hickman got a job in the spring of 1945, and later, a year later, brought his family up from Mississippi, very large family, like typical of many farming families, 9 kids. And while he found a job that was certainly, you know, a step up, a huge step up from being a sharecropper, he said himself, you know, I could see what I was earning at the end of every week. There was a paycheck, there was money in my hand. It was also a kind of cultural shock because, you know, like with many East European immigrants, you know, a generation before, you kind of went from the edge of the Middle Ages to the advanced industrial world literally in a few weeks, and it was, you know, and working in a steel mill was like working inside of a volcano. It's just it was a massive transformation of sort of this work area, but it was a huge step up. But for like most African Americans who, overwhelmingly the number of African Americans who came to the North and to the West, and particularly to Chicago, well, they could find in many cases jobs because, like, you know, many immigrants, whether they travel 50 or 500 or 5,000 miles for a job, in many ways you're encouraged to come because employers know you're going to work hard, because they know you've actually improved your life. They know that you want more. So in some ways you're encouraged to come. But what becomes the source of irritation and frustration and anger is that while you may be able to get a job, you can't find any decent housing. And this is a reoccurring issue for all types of people who have to migrate for work. In Chicago, you know, we're, for example, this is true of most northern cities. It's not as true of the West. But, you know, we've grown up in a world in the last 40 or 50 years where we're used to sort of black neighborhoods being large parts of the city. We talk about the black community, and we talk about large parts of the West Side or large parts of the South Side. And of course, when African Americans came to Chicago from 1900 to 1950, they were confined to a thin sliver, really, of the south side of Chicago, beginning around Cermak and down to the 60s or 70s between State and Cottage Grove Avenue. And it was massively, massively overcrowded. In some sense, it was, you know, when people talk about the ghetto, it was in that sense, a proper sense of what a ghetto was. That is a very narrow area where a certain group of people were prescribed to live in. And because of what were called restrictive covenants or racial covenants at the time, it was perfectly legal for landlords and big real estate companies backed up by the banks to prevent homes or apartment buildings from being sold or rented to African Americans. This is also true of Mexicans and so forth here in Chicago, but it was particularly directed at African Americans. So this thin sliver of the South Side, the old Black Belt or South Side Ghetto, whatever phrase you'd like to use, in some sense was hemmed in by these racial covenants, which was the law of the land up until 1948, until the Supreme Court outlawed these things as unconstitutional. It was massively overcrowded. You found families literally living on top of one another. And of course, one of the things about these type of housing policies is not only did they lead to sort of, racial segregation, but they led to this very toxic economic exploitation. Because if you can't move anywhere, you're at the mercy of your landlord. So you found that African Americans would be stuck in these tiny hovels. Richard Wright wrote some very angry prose about these living conditions in Native Son, and then later in a book called 12 Million Black Voices, where African Americans were paying 2, 3, 4 times the rent for tiny space that was cheaper and larger in any other part of Chicago. So racial segregation and economic exploitation went hand in hand. And when African Americans would try to move out of the ghetto, they would inevitably face racist violence. They would be shot at, physically attacked, their homes would be firebombed, and so forth. And this is the sort of situation that James Hickman found himself in, trying to find a home for his family in 1946 and in 1947. When he later recounted to journalist John Bartlow Martin, his search for housing, it's exhausting reading, because he would work the graveyard shift. If you've ever done it, I've done it at UPS. It's a miserable existence. You start work at 11, 12 at night, you get out at 7 in the morning, and he would go and just basically spend the next 8 hours walking around the city looking for a place to live, and really never finding it. Or he'd be tantalized with one prospect, and then they would slam the door in his face because he had too many kids, or he was African American, and so forth. The other dilemma is that, while he was searching for this, there began to be a process of cutting up these apartments into even smaller ones during World War II and after, landlords to make even more money because of all of the African Americans who were coming north during the war and during the post-war period. And then with returning black veterans from the war, is that landlords would cut up these rooms and these apartments into even tinier apartments. So you would go into a building which previously had 7 or 8 apartments, and landlords would cut them up into 100 rooms and then rent the rooms to 5 or 6 members of a family, and then charge people 5 or 6 times the cost of what people had paid for the previous 3 and 4 bedroom apartment. If you want to know why people hate their landlords, that's exactly where all this comes from. James Hickman ended up finding an apartment. There was a man named David Coleman who was African American himself, who came from Mississippi, who came a little bit earlier than James Hickman to Chicago. Some of his story we just don't know very much about. But through some process, he began renting property and posing and acting as a landlord for certain buildings, particularly one located at 1733 West Washburn, which, if you know the city of Chicago, is essentially at the corner of Roosevelt and Ashland. It's right behind the Jewel there. He offered Hickman an apartment at this place. It was an apartment building that had been previously owned by a woman named Mary Adams. It was filled with large African American families. In some sense, that was the beginning of the black community on the west side of Chicago, because as the South Side ghetto began to become so overcrowded, small pockets of black communities began to spread up on the west side of the city. And this is really kind of the origins of the Black West Side. So in the summer of 1946, James Hickman meets David Coleman. They go over to this apartment building. He shows them an apartment in the basement, which is knee-deep in water. This is the truth. He says, "You want to rent this place?" He says, "No." They shows him an apartment on the second floor, and Coleman says, "Well, this is going to be available at the end of the month You just give me a deposit for $100 and you can have it. But in the meantime, there's a one room apartment up on the attic in the front that you can have in the meantime. And James and Annie Hickman discuss this. They don't really want to do this, but they have all these kids, and they've been spending nearly a year trying to find a home, and they've never found one. So they reluctantly take this place, and this is in the summer of 1946. Well, months come and go, and David Coleman doesn't give them the apartment on the second floor. James Hickman becomes increasingly agitated at the state of things. He confronts David Coleman about this situation and says, well, you know, I want my deposit back, or I want the apartment. And David Coleman says to him, well, if you threaten to take me to court, I'll have my man on the east side come over and burn your place down. And what was later found out during the coroner's hearings into the death of the Hickman children is that David Coleman had threatened all of the tenants with being burned out of their apartments, because what James Hickman wasn't aware of was that David Coleman made several attempts while all the men were at work to bring workmen over to cut up the apartments into even smaller ones, but it was the women of the building who fought him off each time. And as each time he was sort of fought off by the tenants, he began to threaten the remaining tenants more and more with being burned out of their homes. James and Annie Hickman was so worried about the condition of the building, because there actually had been 2 or 3 fires previously to the tragic one that took place, that James Hickman, when he went to work at night at Wisconsin Steel, would ask his 2 oldest sons, who had both been in the Army, to stay with the family overnight because he was so worried about what was going to happen. And then one night, on January 16th, 1947, as usual, James Hickman, with his 2 eldest sons, staying at the apartment, went to work around 9 o'clock and took the long trolley rides. We don't have trolleys in Chicago anymore, but took the long trolley rides to work at Wisconsin Steel. And within 2 hours, a fire broke out in the center of the attic. The attic was divided up into 3 rooms. It spread very quickly. Annie Hickman, who first sensed that something was wrong, got up, opened the door, quickly slammed it closed because of the fire. It was so close to her face that it just frightened her. She closed the door very quickly. She woke all the kids. In one of those sort of miraculous events that's hard to figure out later, her second oldest son, Charles, opened the door and leapt through the flames, somehow surviving unmarked, ran downstairs and called for the rest of the family to come. By then the fire and the smoke was too thick. She closed the door. Her eldest son, Willis, kicked out this tiny little window that they had in their room, and basically the smoke, which is, if you've ever been in a fire, I've been in one, I've witnessed another one closely at hand, the heat and the thick oily smoke is just terrifying. It just pushes you away from it. It pushed those 2 out of the window onto the ledge of the building. While this was happening, the 4 youngest children climbed underneath one of the beds in the room. There were 2 beds. Just as what children do in fires everywhere in the world. When there's a fire, they crawl under their bed or they go into a closet. That's where you find children. And, you know, the young fatalities during fire. That's where you find children. They ultimately had to jump for their lives. 3 stories down to the cold, hard ground in January. The fire spread very quickly. It was put out very quickly by the fire department. And one of the firefighters turned over one of the beds and found the 4 youngest children dead underneath, with the oldest son, Lester, appearing to sort of try to protect his youngest siblings from the fire and the smoke. I think if I was the firefighter who found that, that would probably be my last day on the job. There's only so much of those sort of things that you can see in your life, you know. While all this was happening, James Hickman was at work. One of the things that African Americans, and I think many Latinos, always get frustrated with dealing with city authorities and big employers is they can never remember your name, or they pronounce it wrong, or they just don't, they're just callous and just don't listen to it. So a phone call was made to Wisconsin Steel where they asked for a Hicks. They did get a Hicks on the phone and told him he should go home. There was trouble at his home. Well, Hicks went home and called back and said, there's no problem here. And then finally they called back again and said, hey, oh, it's Hickman, yeah, we're looking for. This was around 4 a.m. He struggled back to his apartment building where the neighbors told him that his 4 youngest children had died and that his wife and his sons were at the Cook County Hospital. As one of the neighbors said at the time, he looked like he was about to lose his mind. This story could have just disappeared there, but what was interesting about it is that the whole of the black community in Chicago was suffering a kind of epidemic of fires in that spring, the winter and the following spring of 1946 and 1947. The Defender newspaper, and it's really tragic, the death of newspapers in our country, but the sort of death of black community newspapers is a particularly despairing one. The Defender documented what was 750 fires between December and March 1947, 46 and 47 in the south side of Chicago alone. These are fires great and small, but that, I mean, the idea that there would be 750 fires is just mostly related to terrible housing conditions. Literally, the ghetto was burning down. I mean, that's literally what was going on at that time. The Cook County Coroner's Office, we're used to, you know, coroners being sort of, well, they're called medical examiners now, mostly, except in a few counties. We're used to them simply being techs. They tell you why someone died. Or in TV, it's CSI, which is, of course, we all know is total fantasy. But at that time, in most counties in the United States, the coroners actually conducted investigations into suspicious deaths, where they would hold public hearings, take sworn testimony, and it would be very wide-ranging investigations. And pretty uniquely, there were four public hearings into the death of the Hickman children that documented not only the horrendous living conditions that the Hickman family found itself in, but also the testimony of all of the neighbors about David Coleman's threats. David Coleman went into hiding for 3 weeks before they finally arrested him on unrelated charges, and he testified later that he never said or did any of these things that his neighbors accused him of. And while the coroner's jury said that they couldn't ultimately determine the cause of the fire, they strongly recommended to the state's attorney's office that they have a further investigation into the cause of the fire and the death of the Hickman children. And this is really the beginning of the second part of the story, which is the non-response from the state attorney's office and the Chicago Police Department, who failed to heed the advice of the Cook County coroner or the pleas of the Hickman family, or just some simple decency and common sense to look into what really happened and why. Willis Hickman, who survived the fire that night, is still alive. He lives on the west side of Chicago. When I interviewed him a year ago, last summer, I asked just very straightforwardly, I just said, Willis, did anybody from the police department, the fire department, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, any investigative agency connected with the state of Illinois, did any of these people ever conduct a formal investigation with you or any member of your family concerning the fire or the death of your youngest brothers and sisters? And he straightforwardly said no. While this non-response to the tragedy took place, this is, of course, when James Hickman's anger, frustration, despair, and mental health is seriously deteriorating during this time. I don't have children, but if I lost 4 of my children in a fire in which the landlord of my building had threatened to precisely do that, and then got no response from the local government to do anything about this, at the very least I would be in a rage 24 hours a day, if not much worse than that. James Hickman began to exhibit signs of schizophrenia, depression, and so forth. This all culminated in July 16th, 1947, 6 months to the day of the fire that killed his children, when he went and had his final confrontation with David Coleman on the south side of Chicago, where he confronted him first about the money that Coleman had stolen from him in a deposit, and then straightforwardly accused him of murdering his children. He shot David Coleman 3 times, mortally wounding him. Coleman died 3 days later. In sharp contrast to the non-response of the police department to the death of his 4 youngest children, the police department acted very quickly to the shooting of David Coleman and arrested James Hickman that night in his home on the far south side of Chicago, which was veterans housing that his son was able to get for the family. Under the state law at the time, James Hickman faced the possibility of death in the electric chair or a minimum of 14 years in prison, and probably a lot more than that. And again, this is where the story could have just disappeared completely from any public view when the case was really taken up by Mike Bartell and the Socialist Workers' Party. They had already had a sort of previous relationship with tenant issues. During the war years, they organized tenant unions across the city of Chicago. They had become very involved in kind of the new civil rights activism that was pioneered by organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality, which was started here in Chicago. It's sort of forgotten that some of the first sit-ins against racist practices were actually here in the city of Chicago, down in the Loop at restaurants and so forth, at High Park. The SWP was very involved in this stuff. There was a skating rink on the south side of Chicago called aptly the White City Skating Rink, which became a sort of battleground over ending racist practices. You know, many of the things that during the research of this book I rediscovered is, in so many ways Chicago was, Mississippi North for African Americans. For example, many of the cemeteries in the city of Chicago are on the south side, but blacks couldn't be buried there. That's why you have, what are referred to as the historically black cemeteries out in Burr Ridge and a few other places, because racist policies wouldn't allow African Americans, including African American veterans, to be buried in the city of Chicago. So the SWP had a background of activism around tenant issues, and actually after the first initial fire that resulted in the death of the Hickman children, the SWP within a few days met with James Hickman and actually organized public forums around the issues of tenant housing and safety and the need for tenants to form unions. They responded very quickly to this. At that time, this was a case about housing safety. And Mike Meyer, who was became a very prominent labor attorney in Chicago, who at that time was the SWP's attorney in Chicago, actually represented the Hickman family at the last coroner's hearing of the investigation into the death of the Hickman children. But then it becomes another case after James Hickman takes his revenge on David Coleman in July. It becomes a very different type of case, and it requires a much bigger political response. And luckily, Mike Bartell was a very talented guy who thought big about things, And so he enlisted a lot of the people many of whom have disappeared from the memory of Chicago history, in the campaign to save James Hickman from the electric chair and to get him out of prison. For example, Willoughby Abner, who attained some who did some very gutsy things as the leader of the NAACP in the 1950s here. It was at that time a local UAW leader, and he and several other people, including a man named Charles Chockless, who was also a local UAW leader, brought the CIO behind a campaign to defend James Hickman. The Congress of Racial Equality in Chicago got behind the campaign. Individuals who were prominent leaders of the NAACP in Chicago got behind the Hickman defense campaign. And it was a very vibrant, very citywide campaign. I asked Frank Fried, who was a returning veteran who first told me about the Hickman case, who was sort of the everyday gopher for the campaign. People don't like the word gopher, but he was the guy who was running around the city trying to stitch the campaign together. He told me about one time about how he went down to a meeting of the Baptist Ministers Alliance, who were a very conservative group of men, and extremely well dressed. And he went down feeling, putting on his best suit and tie to meet with all these ministers to make a pitch for James Hickman. And he was a sort of radical Jewish kid who grew up in Hyde Park, had never been to a meeting like this before. And he started reading his little pitch to the ministers about why they should support the defense campaign. And they halted him after like 3 or 4 sentences and basically said, well, we're with you. What do you want from us? And he said, well, could you take up a collection at all your churches on Sunday and issue letters of support? And they all said, okay. And really, I think the response from the CIO unions, many of the black churches, many of the other communities, organizations, the Hickman campaign, represented precisely the type of indignity and anger that the housing situation as a whole affected basically the black community in Chicago. And that's why you saw the sympathy for Hickman and support for him among a wide range of institutions. It's also important to remember that one of the things that Bartel, because he thought big, is that we needed to bring in big names to support Hickman's campaign to kind of draw that media attention that the mainstream media ignores you unless you have some famous person behind you. And he drew in 2 people that I think have been largely forgotten, or if they were remembered, they're sort of remembered as eccentrics. Willard Motley was probably one of the most important novelists about the city of Chicago. He's completely forgotten. He was the first Bud Billiken, which was a character for the Defender newspaper. He wrote a book in published a book in 1947 called Knock on Any Door, which later became a movie with Humphrey Bogart. It was one of the best-selling books of 1947. He wrote a public appeal for Hickman that was published in 100 black newspapers across the country. It was very, very important appeal that Hickman wrote. And the other person was Tallulah Bankhead, who's now had 6 Broadway plays about her. She was a stage and screen actress at the time. 6 Broadway plays is a lot to have for somebody. Jesus only got 1, as far as I remember, but Tallulah got 6. And she was famous partly because her father had been the Speaker of the House under Roosevelt, and she was from Alabama. And as she would later very, straightforwardly tell people, she despised her racist relatives intensely. And she was sort of a maverick aristocrat in some ways. And she sort of became this kind of outspoken advocate for racial equality in the United States, but particularly in the theater and in film. And she actually spoke at anti-lynching rallies in 1945 and 46 in the city of Chicago. And when the Hickman Defense Campaign organized this very large rally of 1,200 people at the Metropolitan Community Church, which had been the center, really, of civil rights and labor activism in the black community at that time, she was the keynote speaker. She brought the house down. And it was really a combination of all of this sort of stuff, the kind of the on-the-ground organizing, mobilizing union support, bringing in people like Willard Motley and Tallulah Bankhead that gave the campaign national attention, that really forced the state's attorney's office to back off from calling for the death penalty. They had kind of let the issue hang out there about what punishment they were going to ask for Hickman when they went to trial. And they announced on the eve of the trial they weren't going to ask for the death penalty. So that was a sort of sign that the movement was having its impact. But then the trial itself happens. And you want to have, in any political defense campaign, you want to have a vibrant community movement, labor-supported movement, but you also want to put together the best competent legal team that you can possibly have. And I got to say that the SWP really put together an amazing legal team for Hickman. Mike Meyer, who, like I talked about before, was the SWP's attorney, well-versed in issues of housing and housing law, was the lead attorney. Leon Dupre, who became probably the most famous independent alderman and a thorn in the side of Daley the First. Now we get to number them. Daley the First had worked with Meyer on many cases. Dupre, who people kind of remember as a maverick Democrat. At that time, he was a socialist. He actually had met Trotsky. He later talked about in his autobiography how he had a date with oh God, this is where the memories. Selma Hayek played her in the movie.
Frida Kahlo.
Frida Kahlo, Jesus, all right. Edit that out, guys, will you? With Frida Kahlo. Took her to the movies one night when he was visiting Trotsky in Mexico. But Dupre himself had a long history of being involved in some of the tougher labor battles in this town. He was part of the committee that investigated the cause behind the Little Steel Massacre and many other things. So he brought a wealth of experience. And the person who rounded out the team was William Temple, who was a lead attorney for the NAACP in Chicago. And between the three of them, what they did with the trial is they instead of James Hickman being on trial, they really put David Coleman and the housing and the racist laws around housing in Chicago on trial. And after a very short trial, and when the jury came in, they declared that they were deadlocked. It was 7-5 for acquittal. And the state's attorney announced that they were going to retry Hickman. Immediately, the Hickman Defense Committee organized a national letter-writing campaign, and thousands of letters poured into the state's attorney's office. I also suspect that some people in the state's attorney's office were not very enthusiastic about this case, because one of the things that was very important to remember is that despite the efforts of the prosecutors to portray Hickman as a kind of cold-blooded killer, everybody knew about the death of Hickman's kids. It was front-page news. And so they never could get an upper hand in the prosecution on Hickman. Samuel Friedman, who was the prosecutor in the case, when they finally went for a settlement, he got up before the judge, apparently from the news accounts held up many letters in his hand about the outpouring of support for Hickman, and said, "We believe this man has paid enough," and announced that they had had a settlement where Hickman would have 2 years probation and would walk out of court a free man. Now, this is a story that's, you know, pretty amazing. And the most famous, the biggest national outlet for the story was later written by a man named John Bartlow Martin, who was at the time in the 40s and 50s one of the best-known magazine writers in Chicago. He was a regular contributor to Harper's. He wrote a lot for Harper's around issues of housing and race. He wrote a very famous article about a mining disaster in Centralia, Illinois, that kind of catapulted him into national prominence. It's sort of the story that kind of made him. He interviewed really the Hickman family and James and Annie Hickman about what took place in their lives and in their final confrontation with David Coleman. And that's really you know, in terms of print, that was probably the biggest outlet that the story got. One of the more important parts of that story is that Ben Shahn, who was probably one of the most famous American artists at that time, was somebody who was paired up regularly with Bartlow Martin and his stories, and he did these beautiful illustrations about the Hickman family story and tragedy that really, when you look at Martin's article, I mean, it's a very good writing, and you wish people could write more stuff like that these days, but what really lifts the story from the page that gives it a human quality is Ben Shahn's artwork. I'm just lucky the fact that I've written a book where we got that artwork to be reprinted. It's not very often that you have one of the most famous artists in American history illustrate your book. That won't happen again, I can guarantee you that. But it's between those two, between Martin's article and Shahn's artwork, that the Hickman story sort of survived in one thin way for the years after the story, the tragedy, and the Hickman family returned to their private lives. I think that there's a couple of reasons why this story is not better known. I think part of it has to do with the fact that when American working class and radical and socialist history is written, there's a prominence given to the history of the Communist Party, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, which is both understandable because it was a huge mass party that had a huge impact on American life in those decades, and that's certainly true. But to some degree, it's also kind of crowded out and slightly distorted the fact that there was also a broader left than that, and a smaller organization and a smaller tradition, such as American Trotskyism or revolutionary socialism, as I prefer to refer to it, has been sort of either written out of American history or just ignored. And so you can look at great books like, Labor's Untold Story by Murray, which everybody should read, except when it talks about 1934, it talks about the San Francisco General Strike, and it talks about Toledo, but it doesn't say anything about Minneapolis, and which was the Minneapolis trucking strike was led by the American Trotskyists, and all three of those events were instrumental to the rise of the CIO. Now that may be one crude example, but I think far too much of the time it's crowded out. And I think that part of what this story is for me is it's mostly, first and foremost, a story about an incredible tragedy, that 4 young people lost their lives for simply greed and profit, and they are 4 people who may have changed all of our lives, and that's a tragedy in and of itself. James Hickman had great hopes for his youngest children, and those hopes, of course, could never be realized because of that. But it's also a story, I think, about the type of socialist movement we need to get back to being. One that can relate to the lives of working class people, that can make a difference in people's lives, and ultimately fight for a better future, because I think the conditions that created the Hickman tragedy exist in a similar, but of course different way now, and because particularly of the particular way the economic crisis has impacted housing over the last couple of years, I think that there's potentially many James Hickmans being made right now, and when people don't get justice, they'll find justice in their own ways, and hopefully we can be there to get the justice for them that they surely deserve and that they don't get from the system as it is. So I'll just end there. On your time. I think they invite you to go to the mic.
Okay, we're going to open the mic up, so just come up here and, pontificate or ask questions or do whatever you want to do, but it's just an open microphone.
I read a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, and it was not written by Michelle Alexander. I can't think of who wrote it.
Isabel Wilkerson.
Isabel Wilkerson, yes. And her description of that ghetto in Chicago made what you said completely understandable. You may have a similar description in your book, but it is very, very well described in that book. And so I just wanted to throw that out so people could take a look there, and if they need to really understand how the ghetto was absolutely closed. It was absolutely packed with people. There were no places. They could not go anywhere else. And anyway, and then I just wanted to thank you for this. You've done a really great job of explaining all this to us, and that was about all I had to say.
Thank you, Jim.
What effect did this have on the broader picture of the economic and segregation situation that existed at that time? It sounds as though this acquittal was a measure of justice in some fashion, but I grew up in the West Side in the 50s and 60s, still very heavily segregated. I recall once where a black family had tried to move into Cicero, burned them out around the early 50s.
Well, let me answer try to answer that question. I think in some ways one of the things that's is important about the Hickman case is that many of the people who contributed their political skills and knowledge and connections to the case were people who were a product of the great radicalization of the American working class in the 1930s and 1940s, and they had a broad range of experiences. I mean, Mike Bartell, for example, you know, was a New Yorker. He became a radical at City College in New York, like a whole generation of Americans did, who were both, you know, people who were supporters of the, you know, the mainstream Communist Party, or they were part of, you know, the Trotskyist movement and so forth. You know, one of the things about, there was this great interview that a friend rediscovered with Bartell for me, where he talked about, you know, one of the things he learned from student politics was, you know, how to be, you know, you have to be, you know, an upfront, in-your-face organizer. And he talked about how their college president at City College in the 1930s was a guy named Freddie Robinson, and the students nicknamed him Fascist Freddie because, well, because he was a, no, because he invited Mussolini's student federation leaders to come and speak on campus, and they organized this event where they busted up the meetings. And Robinson himself was this sort of ridiculous combination of Mussolini and Mr. Chips. He was just this sort of, you know, he would wade in with an umbrella attacking picket lines of students on campus and so forth. But he loved the activism, and he brought his activism with student politics and then the labor movement. He brought, you know, those years of experience to the Hickman campaign, as many other people did. He was active on the waterfront during World War II in the early days out in California. And, you know, he was an example of the type of people who were produced by this mass radicalization. It's also true that the Hickman campaign took place in 1947, and that in some ways is the end of the radical era. In 1948 it becomes clearly to an end when Henry Wallace has this kind of, you know, Don Quixote-esque effort at running for the presidency, which kind of exposes how weak the left was, right? So in some sense the Hickman campaign represents the best of what people brought from the 1930s and 40s. But it's also the end of the era. I think in some ways, if the Hickman case took place a year later, I don't think they would have had the same outcome, because the Cold War repression, the whole political atmosphere was just completely different. Now, it is, though, important to remember is that the issue of restrictive covenants was the subject of all sorts of activism and lawsuits all across the country at that time, and had been for many years. And so a year later, in the fall of 1948, the Supreme Court outlaws, rules unconstitutional, these restrictive covenants, which are really at the heart of the Hickman case. Because if James Hickman could have lived anywhere he wanted to, he would have never met David Coleman. He would have never suffered these humiliations. You know, all the things that happened would have most likely never happened. I can't say that the Hickman case directly contributed to that. I don't want to say that, because I don't think that evidence is there. But I think the general activism around the issue of restrictive covenants does have an impact with the Supreme Court rulings the following year.
Hi, I was going to ask a similar question to what this gentleman asked about the structural changes, so I guess I'll just make the comment that I was going to say before that I like to look at court cases like this as kind of a correlation of forces, because I think a lot of times we get bogged down in what the letter of the law is, but you can see today, you know, I mean, the courts support the power structure, but even when that legal framework is not sufficient to allow the power structure to do what it leads one to do, like a war in Iraq or a bank bailout, they find a way to make it happen, right? And I think this is a beautiful example of the other side of that, where there's a correlation of forces, people coming together from different parts of society, and even though this man committed murder, they said, no, this murder was committed in a context of severe injustice, and for that reason he should go free, and they were allowed to, you know, that was successful. So hearing what your response to his question is, I guess it's disconcerting to me that there wasn't more structural change that came out of that, this wellspring of support that supported James Hickman.
So I have two quick questions. One is thinking back over the book by Burl Satter, who I think endorses your book. It's a very interesting book. And as you know from that book, she talks about a history of 1950s Chicago, well after the 48 Supreme Court decision, where racist housing policies continued apace. African Americans in Chicago and many other places could not get a mortgage.
Right.
And a takeaway from that book for me was that this kind of racial housing policy, as informal as it may have been, tended to exacerbate and emphasize a racial divide in the city. So my question is, in the Hickman case, was the organizing around his defense a multi-ethnic or multi-racial coalition? And the second question is in regards to the history of sectarianism that exists, I think, particularly in the post-war era. I think you talked a little bit about the fact that the Communist Party movement and its organizations in unions and community organizing was very well known. And I know, and we all know, that there was friction between the communist-oriented movement and the revolutionary or Trotskyist-oriented movement. And I'm wondering if you saw any signs of friction or the alternate or the opposite, unity among socialists who may not have agreed in other areas, particularly in this case, and if so, are there implications on either of those?
Those are just small questions. Curiosity. Was it a jury trial? Was the not guilty by reason of insanity plea requested, since you mentioned that he suffered some symptoms of schizophrenia? And also, perhaps, do you think they let it go for public pressure? Was it somehow related to the cover-up on why there was no investigation and very little police activity during the after the fire? Kind of let go, make a deal. It seems like it's possible that this case really doesn't reflect the I would say the conscience of the people at the time, as much as the rage that people will have toward their children's killer. I mean, people have, when children are involved, it's above racial and ethnic and religious lines. So was that, do you think, a factor as well?
Go ahead, Ben. Maybe I'll sum up after this.
Well, I have a quick question.
Sure.
That is this Association of Baptist Ministers, I assume they were black? This is
Yes.
a black association? Okay. And I have a comment. I'm kind of struck, as I listen to this, by my own lack of a feeling understanding for this period in American history. I've read about, and I think I can sort of feel my way into, as best I can, the years of the Depression and the years of the war, and also the years of the 50s with the Cold War repression and the McCarthy era and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. But I'm really struck by how I can't seem to feel my way into this period between World War II and 1950. And of course, you sort of anticipated my question and comment that this seems like a very, although very short, a very different time. But like I say, I can't seem to feel my way into. My father always spoke of what a different time that was from 1945 to 1950, and how quickly it disappeared.
Right.
So that's, I guess, like and such things as NAACP leading activism, and that seems very foreign to me. Like I say, this is a short sliver in time when I'm getting the feeling, like I say, it flew away very quickly. But again, I have a hard time feeling my way into what that period of time was like. Thank you.
Well, how about this? If there's any more questions or comments, and then I'll sum up. How does that sound? Sure, go ahead.
actually, I wasn't going to bring this up, but because of what he said, I wanted to introduce a theory that I heard this week, that the problem that has bedeviled racist politics in the United States is that when the slaves were freed in the Civil War, the political establishment, I don't know any better word, that's not the right word for it, I don't know what to call it, became very fearful that there had been unleashed in the United States, within its own borders, a huge number of subversives, namely the slaves that had been released and that were now free. And this constituted a possible fifth column that was within our borders, and there were many people who wanted to ship everybody out to Liberia, and of course the slaves themselves, the freed men and women, definitely objected to this. And I'm reminded that J. Edgar Hoover said that Martin Luther King was the most dangerous man in America, and that this concept of the enemy within was very material in the kinds of situations that we are talking about here.
Well, a couple of things. One is that the stuff about the post-war period, I think, is now being subject to a lot more research and scholarship. One of the best books to read is Martha Biondi's book, To Stand and Fight, about the post-war years in New York City and the struggle for civil rights and economic equality in the city. That really opened up, before I even read about the Hickman case, that kind of taught me something about the post-war era that I had never really thought about before. I think that one of the things about World War II is that it raised expectations among a broad layer of people in the United States about what the post-war world was going to look like, most notably among African Americans who said, we're not going to repeat the experience of World War I, where we sacrifice our bodies and our lives and our labors, and we're just going to be lynched afterwards. We're not, and to go back to where we came from with no progress. That is not going to happen this time around. For many working class people of whatever ethnicity, of race, the idea was we had sacrificed our lives and our work during the war years. We expect a bigger piece of the pie afterwards. There was these type of expectations, and that wasn't easily contained. I think many of us who study labor history know about, the post-war strike wave, but usually that's all we're taught about. It's a much more broader sense that American society was going to be more inclusive, more justice, that in fact, there was a lot of things when we look back upon it that, now, seem, almost utopian. Like there was an expectation that there would be a labor party formed in the United States and that Walter Reuther was going to lead it and run for president in 1948. There's a whole layer of things about what the future could have been in 1946 or 47, which had to be clamped down by Cold War repression, the Red Scare in the United States, the physical removal of socialists and communists and other radicals from the labor movement, from the civil rights movement at the time, and so forth. And that's all about clamping down those expectations. One of the things about the Hickman case is that they pleaded, not guilty by reason of insanity for his case. And I think one of the jurors, because we don't have a lot of what the jurors believed or said why they voted the way they did, because you just didn't have the same sort of media coverage that takes place now. Not completely. Sometimes they did it, but where now you go and you interview all the jurors and they tell you why they voted what they did, right? We only know what one juror said, which was, one of the men said, if I was Hickman, I would have done the same thing. What was interesting about the jury is that it was half men and half women, and they chose a woman as the foreman of the jury, which I thought was actually kind of unique for 1947, and I'm not exactly sure why. See, this is the part of some of the stuff about the Hickman case, I've been able to find out a lot more about it, even though there were many people who warned me that and rightly so, that I may have never find enough material to actually write a book. And part of the pitch I make about the legacy of the Hickman case is the importance of preserving your own history. Because if you don't preserve it, most likely nobody else is going to preserve it for you. So one of the frustrations of the case was that I could never find the trial transcript. Part of that's the law of Illinois. If a trial is not appealed, the local court is not required to keep a copy of it. It's gone. Now, there are certain articles that were written, including John Bartlow Martin's article and one other article that was written in the 60s about the case, where there are these quotes that appear to be quotes from a trial transcript. But when I interviewed the one author who's surviving from the article from the 1960s, he said he just couldn't remember where he got those quotes from. Frank Fried, who was the the everyday organizer for the campaign, lost everything he had related to the Hickman case because his house was burned down during the Oakland fires of 1991. Much of the raw material that I have about the case was because Sidney Lentz, who played a very important role in the case and became a very important anti-war activist in the 1960s and a historian, was something of a pack rat, thank God, because he kept a lot of this stuff, and that's all at the Chicago Historical Museum. And he wrote about it in his autobiography. But a lot of the stuff related to the case that I got, like the quotes about living conditions, come from the Cook County Coroner's Office, which is a place that I was not expecting to get material from. It's just not the usual place that you look, and luckily I stumbled across that, because if I didn't, I wouldn't have had a book. I mean, that's to be very honest about it. I think the one thing that's really great about the Hickman story is that it very much was a multiracial defense committee and defense campaign that brought together, civil rights activists, labor activists, and so forth, where an open revolutionary organization like the SWP played a central role in organizing the campaign. Of course, the downside of if the outcome of the case was different, I would have written more about this, is that during this entire time, the American Communist Party was totally hostile to the work that the SWP was doing. Remember, the CP was a deeply Stalinist organization. Any criticism of Stalin's Russia was seen as being agents of fascism. In fact, some of this you look back and it's just goony, but this was believed by people, right? So the night of the biggest rally for Hickman that Tallulah Bankhead spoke at, an overwhelmingly African-American audience, a lot of trade union leaders speaking on the platform, the Communist Party shows up and hands out a pamphlet that's entitled Trotskyism, Agent of Fascism to the crowd. I mean, it's just sort of goony. Now, it's also true that the CP was, at the same time, was also under enormous pressure at that time. They were we saw, the Red Scare and domestic repression was already beginning, and so forth. But I think that, part of this is also the next left, in America, because my own personal opinion is that the great tragedy of the American left in the 30s and 40s and the 60s and 70s is that in both cases, in different versions, Stalinism ends up playing a role in wrecking really the radicalism of those generations, whether you saw Russia, Russia under Stalin as your model for socialism, or Mao's China as your model for socialism, that ends up really kind of being the thing that is a detour and I think a wrecking the movement. But I think that for me, getting back to a kind of socialism which is based on democracy, rule of the vast majority of people, based on workers' power, I mean, that's the type of socialism that I think was represented by the SWP, and I think they brought that type of inclusive movement to the Hickman campaign, which I think was really central to winning. Let me see if there's anything else I forgot. I think, to end is, on maybe we can talk informally about this, is I think the housing situation today is the racism of the subprime mortgage fiasco is pretty glaring. I mean, there's a couple of different groups in Chicago that do grassroots organizing. around foreclosures, and of course all the neighborhoods that are particularly victimized are first and foremost African American, second Latino, in that aspect, housing for African Americans in particular has always been a battle. In Chicago, it was the fight to get rid of restrictive covenants that hemmed people into a horrible ghetto. Then it was the battle to try to get mortgages by getting rid of this contract buying system that Beryl Sater documents so well. But then once you won that battle, you had to fight redlining, which is, okay, we'll give you a mortgage on one hand, but we won't give it to anybody who lives in these certain neighborhoods, which happen to be overwhelmingly African American. And then when that was defeated legally, that's when we got subprime. So the issue of race and housing persists. And I think that the great legacy of fighting against all that is you have to organize from below and organize homeowners and organize tenants to fight for justice, because real estate companies and landlords are not known for their altruism, and the banks that back them up are not, and it's a continual fight and for decent housing and access, which today I think impacts all working class Americans, whether they're black, white, Latino, immigrants, native born, or whatever. And I think it's going to be one of the great civil rights and class justice issues of our time. So I'll just end there.